signing of the Treaty of Versailles on June 28, 1919, the armistice nevertheless marked the practical end of World War I as a military conflict. The United States emerged from the war in a uniquely advantageous position. Unlike the European powers, the American homeland suffered no physical devastation. Wartime mobilization had expanded U.S. industry, American agriculture had supplied global markets, and American banks had extended vast loans to the Allies. By 1919, the United States had shifted from a net debtor nation to the world's leading creditor. After but a brief but sharp post-war recession in 1920 to 1921, the American economy entered a period of sustained expansion. This period of relative stability and industrial productivity became known as the Roaring Twenties. But what happened to the CPI and all the media infrastructure that had developed around it during World War I? Well, it didn't just disappear, it was instead repurposed. Techniques pioneered by the CPI migrated into advertising, into public relations, film, and radio. Consider, for example, one Edward Bernays, one of the most influential Americans of the 20th century, but one whom you've likely never heard of. Bernays was the so-called father of public relations and pioneered the field of PR as we know it today. During World War I, Bernays worked in the CPI for its Bureau of Latin American Affairs, where his job was building support for the war both domestically and abroad, with a focus especially on businesses operating in Latin America. Bernays described his work as, and I quote, psychological warfare. Not very soft power, is it? Very hard power. Bernays later stated of his work in the CPI the following, quote, "There was one basic lesson I learned in the CPI, that efforts comparable to those applied by the CPI to affect the attitudes of the enemy, of neutrals, and people of this country could be applied with equal facility to peacetime pursuits." In other words, what could be done for a nation at war could be done for organizations and people in a nation at peace. And Bernays did just that. After the war in 1923, Bernays wrote his first book, Crystallizing Public Opinion. In 1929, Bernays organized a successful advertising campaign encouraging women to smoke more cigarettes. Fun fact about that campaign, by the way, Bernays' cigarette ad campaign actually co-opted first-wave feminism. He paid women walking in the Easter Sunday parade to smoke so-called torches of freedom, including women's rights activist Ruth Hale, who was infamously filmed during the parade stating, "Women, light another torch of freedom, fight another sex taboo." Which just goes to show you, the co-opting of feminism by capital is by no means new, and it's something for all of us to be vigilant of, but I digress. In 1928, Bernays published Propaganda, arguably his most influential book until The Engineering of Consent, which was published in 1955. In Propaganda, Bernays wrote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate these unseen mechanisms of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country." You see, for Bernays, democracy wasn't a function of an informed public rationally deliberating policy, as we often imagine it to be. Instead, Bernays saw democracy as a function of, and here is this term again, manufactured consent. The role of the media, of advertising, of public relations was not to inform citizens neutrally, but to guide behavior, to reinforce their beliefs, and to align mass psychology with institutional needs. Now, to the casual observer, this resembles authoritarianism, but Bernays didn't see it that way. He saw it instead as a necessity in a society too complex for direct understanding. Persuasion is the next best thing. Don't understand, instead feel. And in Bernays' logic, the capitalist system requires this to survive. Mass production requires mass consumption. There's no reason to produce a ton if there's nobody to consume it, right? Mass consumption then thereby requires managed desire. You can't get people to consume a ton unless they really want to. Managed desire then requires psychological coordination. Those who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses, writes Bernays, have pulled the wires which control the public mind. And to that end, Bernays saw no distinction between commercial persuasion and political persuasion. Propaganda, he writes, is the executive arm of the invisible government. This is why the American government has never needed to outright subordinate the press in the manner of authoritarian regimes. The forces of capital already discipline the media. As we've shown, doctrine subordinates journalism not through coercion but through aligned incentives. Bernays was onto something. He had identified, perhaps before anyone else, the propaganda model of mass media in capitalistic democratic societies. The very same model that Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky would later write about in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media. Herman and Chomsky argue that news passes through 5 key filters. First, media outlets are large corporations which reflect corporate interests. That's obvious, right? Second, these corporations then depend on advertisers and thus try to avoid content that might upset their financial benefactors. Third, through 5 key filters, the propaganda model of mass media in capitalistic democratic societies. The very same model that Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky would later write about in their 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent: The Political Economy of the Mass Media. Herman and Chomsky argue that news passes through 5 key filters. First, media outlets are large corporations which reflect corporate interests. That's obvious, right? Second, these corporations then depend on advertisers and thus try to avoid content that might upset their financial benefactors. Third, the journalists in these corporations rely on government and corporate sources, which discourages adversarial reporting. Fourth, negative responses in the form of lawsuits, complaints, or outright political pressure punishes dissenting views. And lastly, there is a dominant ideological framework which frames what is considered acceptable discourse, which is to say the boundaries are established to generally exclude certain types of thinking by limiting the spectrum of acceptable opinion while simultaneously allowing lively debate inside of that spectrum, which gives the illusion of free thinking, all while the presuppositions of the system are reinforced by the limit of the debate. These are the aligned incentives to which Bernays hints at and which were already visible in the late 1920s. These aligned incentives, however, were about to face their first true stress test. In October of 1929, the American financial system collapsed, and what followed was a crisis not merely of economics but also of credibility. For you see, for a decade, Americans had been told that the markets were rational, growth was permanent, and progress inevitable. Now, before their eyes, that narrative no longer described reality. What followed was what we call the Great Depression. And just as how the Depression forced individuals and families to figure out how they might survive economically, it also forced institutions to discover which communicative practices still functioned under the conditions of systemic failure. Given the circumstances, reassurance based on prosperity or consumption no longer worked, and persuasion that assumed that confidence risked producing cynicism instead. Can't just tell people that things are great when they aren't, or people will start to disbelieve. And so the propaganda apparatus turned inwards. By such tools, electricity dispels the dark and lifts heavy burdens from human shoulders. Hence the letters GE are more than a trademark. They are an emblem of service, the initials of a friend. Times aren't great, but we are part of what makes the rest of your life bearable, so, it's not our fault. You might recognize this kind of corporate behavior during other periods of economic recession or hardship, by the way, when the system is tested. What this is propaganda. In any case, this self-preservation mechanism meant that when the United States once again faced total war, it did so with the media ecosystem intact, and already accustomed to participating in wartime mobilization from World War I. Once again, all that was needed was a spark.
Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards. Costly to our Navy was the loss of war vessels, airplanes, and equipment, but more costly to Japan was the effectiveness of its foul attack in immediately unifying America in its determination to fight and win the war thrust upon it, and to win the peace that will follow.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the American conscience and served as the perfect catalyst. Once again, the United States found itself dragged into a major war, but this time, at least on the home front, America was more prepared. Once again, the US government coordinated messaging and morale through centralized institutions, most notably through the Office of War Information, or OWI, established in 1942. Hollywood studios, radio stations, newspaper publishers, and advertisers alike rapidly aligned with the war effort, often proactively. Many of them remembered what it was like to starve, and they were eager to get back into the groove of things. Just like with the CPI, cooperation promised access, legitimacy, and thereby profitability, whereas opposition offered none of the above and potentially even negative responses. Everybody knew the rules of the game, the incentives were already in place. Film studios produced patriotic features and newsreels and training films, radio broadcasts blended entertainment with war news and moral framing. Even advertising adopted wartime themes linking consumption to sacrifice and duty. The line between entertainment and propaganda became increasingly blurred. Now it's worth noting that the United States was not unique in deploying propaganda during World War II, of course not. What distinguishes American deployment of media in World War II is not merely the existence of propaganda, but how thoroughly said propaganda integrated into the commercial entertainment and everyday culture, specifically through aligned incentives rather than through centralized coercion. There was the overt federal government-produced stuff, such as Frank Capra's Why We Fight, a genuinely fascinating series of films that I've referenced multiple times in past videos. But there were also more direct private-public partnerships, which co-opted the existing commercial media sector. During World War II, Disney produced hundreds of films for the US government, and in some cases allied war efforts, including training films, instructional shorts, morale pieces, and more, often working directly with the Office of War Information and the armed forces themselves. Consider, though, Disney's wartime output was not primarily designed to persuade Americans or allies that the war was just. By 1942, that question had already been rather decisively settled. Instead, Disney's films taught audiences how to live in a wartime society, which is to say, Disney's animations were not needed to legitimize war, they were instead used to normalize war. Consider, for example, the Disney cartoon The Spirit of 43, a cartoon starring Donald Duck produced for the US Treasury. The cartoon does not show Pearl Harbor or give justification for the war. What the cartoon does is it teaches viewers to pay their income taxes, and it frames taxation as this cheerful civic duty with compliance linked to national unity. In other words, Spirit of 43 instructs citizens how to function inside of and make sense of wartime bureaucracy. Consider also the rather infamous Der Führer's Face, a satirical short in which Donald Duck has a nightmare in which he is a Nazi instead of a God-fearing American. Again, the enemy is not up for debate. Instead, fascism is rendered absurd through caricature and ridicule. But you will note that there is no understanding here to be gleaned about what anyone actually found appealing about fascism to begin with. This is a pattern in American media. Once again, complex ideological conflict is flattened into something emotionally legible. The viewer is not asked to reason through the nature of fascism. They are instead invited to feel alignment instinctively. But Mooney, I can hear you say, are you really suggesting that we should have to think about why Nazis, fascists, or imperial militarists are wrong? Shouldn't that be obvious? Look, the problem isn't about having a sense of right or wrong. You should have that. The problem is developing a sense of right or wrong without any foundational understanding. When alignment is learned through feelings rather than analysis, the alignment becomes detachable from its context. Let me explain, right? If one only learns that Nazis were the enemy and that they wore skulls on their hats, but not why they were the enemy, then when the same logic returns in a different uniform without skulls on their hats, will it be recognized? If there is no foundational understanding, if you do not understand the context, then your moral orientation becomes portable. A vibes-based, effective understanding of morality can be redirected without arguments, and new enemies can be manufactured for feelings to latch onto. Which is to say, morality built on feelings but without underlying logic or reasoning can be redirected also without logic towards new heroes or villains. And said villains don't even have to be real, they only have to feel real. And by proxy, once media succeeds in normalizing power in this way, legitimacy no longer depends on persuasion at all. It depends only on the continuity of narrative and control over framing. Consider how this was employed during and after World War II. The Japanese went from subhuman conniving gremlins to our beloved and culturally sophisticated friends. The Chinese went from the undesirable yellow peril to the people of peace and culture to the communist menace to our open market good commie neighbors to the nefarious enemy of the free world in the span of a single century. And as for the Russians, well, that finally brings us into the Cold War.
You might call this a college town, communist style, as part of a long-range plan to destroy our free way of life. These young communists are studying the economic, political, and religious institutions that are the very heartbeat of America. The courses here in this strangest of all schools: espionage as a science, propaganda as an art, sabotage as a business.
The end of World War II saw the United States and the Soviet Union emerge as the world's two dominant powers, each representing a fundamentally different political, economic, and ideological system. Though they'd been wartime allies against the Axis powers, this partnership quickly gave way to conflict. In February of 1946, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, one George F. Kennan, sent an unusually lengthy correspondence back to Washington which would later become known as the Long Telegram. In it, Kennan argued that Soviet behavior could not be understood through the lens of short-term interests or diplomatic misunderstandings. Instead, he described the Soviet system as fundamentally and ideologically committed to conflict with capitalism, because the legitimacy of the Soviet regime depended on the existence of this conflict. At the same time, Kennan also observed that Soviet leaders were not irrational. They were risk-averse and primarily concerned with internal stability. As such, Kennan believed that while the Soviet Union would seek to expand its influence wherever resistance appeared weak, it would avoid direct military confrontation with a stronger opponent. From this analysis emerged the strategy of containment, not the destruction of the Soviet Union but the long-term prevention of its expansion. Now, Kennan's diagnosis carried a profound strategic implication. If direct war between America and the Soviet Union was both undesirable and potentially catastrophic, and neither side was committed to diplomacy, then conflicts could only be resolved by proxy. On the surface, this war of proxies appeared to be a clash of influence and alignment, wherein culture, education, and information systems became the instruments through which said alignment was to be produced and maintained. Soft power. But both sides understood from the get-go that this soft power was but a facade. In his 1961 farewell address, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a five-star general who had overseen the Allied victory in Europe, warned the American public about what he called the military-industrial complex, a permanent armaments industry intertwined with government planning capable of shaping national priorities in peacetime and sustaining a permanent war footing. Eisenhower's warning was not limited to weapons alone, though. For you see, total war had required not merely factories and armies, but as we saw, systems for managing perception. Propaganda offices, press coordination, right? And just like the factories, just like the military bases, these systems of perception control were never fully dismantled either. Just like in World War I, they migrated, embedding themselves into commercial media, into advertising, not generally through overt censorship or control, but once again through aligned incentives. It was a military media axis built semi-purposefully, sure, but reinforced and cemented capitalistically. It was the product of this self-reinforcing system that theorists would later describe, most notably American political scientist Joseph Nye, as soft power. Soft power, you may recall, is defined by Nye as the ability of a state to shape the preferences of others not through coercion or payment, but through attraction. Where hard power operates through military force or economic pressure, soft power operates through culture and political values and perceived legitimacy. In Nye's framework, a country gets others to want what it wants because its way of life appears more desirable than other ways of life. Importantly, Nye does not deny the existence or importance of hard power. His argument is not that tanks or nukes were irrelevant during the Cold War, but that they were insufficient on their own. Nuclear weapons constrained direct confrontation, and as we will see, economic coercion had its limits. What ultimately mattered, according to Nye, was which system people believed in. And from this perspective, the Cold War was not won primarily on the battlefield, but in the realm of perception. Now, at first glance, Nye's theory maps remarkably well onto Cold War outcomes. Here's the typical Nye argument. The United States did not conquer most of Western Europe through force. Most of those states aligned themselves willingly with the Americans and allowed American military bases to be placed in their territory. American political institutions remained stable. Consumption expanded and cultural products from Hollywood to fashion to popular music circulated globally and were widely consumed even in societies that formally opposed American foreign policy. By contrast, the Soviet Union struggled to generate comparable cultural attraction. While it possessed immense military power, its political system seems to have inspired fear more often than admiration, and restrictions on speech, movement, and cultural exchange appeared to limit the appeal of the Soviet model. If seen as a competition between these two visions of modernity then, the American model, Nye argues, proved more attractive not just to foreign governments or elites, but to the populations themselves. This attraction then shaped patterns of alliances by influencing newly decolonized states deciding which bloc to join or emulate. Soft power, according to Nye, is not merely about winning friends and influencing people, it's about creating durable systems of cooperation. Which is to say, you don't need to threaten or coerce as often because others already share your base assumptions about order and progress and are thereby keen to follow along. Which brings us back to the beginning of the video, right? Nye's point of view is that American cultural influence during the Cold War was the defining asset of American victory. Our system generated more genuine attraction than the Soviet system. It's a very comforting narrative, isn't it? If power can be exercised through attraction rather than force, then leadership can be benevolent instead of domineering. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. But as we continue, let's revisit a question that we've already asked. What order does power operate in? Does American culture persuade the world on its own, or does it circulate because military, economic, and institutional power have already structured the field in which choice becomes possible at all? In other words, is Nye describing an independent form of power, Or is this soft power simply what American hard power looks like once victory has already been secured? Is joining the American cultural sphere actually a choice, or is it made within a lattice that constrains the very capacity to choose? Neoliberal institutionalism argues that while the international system may be anarchic, states are not condemned to perpetual conflict. International institutions such as alliances, trade regimes, norms, and organizations can reduce uncertainty, facilitate cooperation, and shape state behavior over time. As long as the system produces broadly rising prosperity, disparities of power can be tolerated or even normalized. There is, however, an older and far more pessimistic tradition in international relations theory upon which neoliberal institutionalism is partially built. This school of thought is known as realism. Realism as a theory of international relations is as old as Thucydides, but it emerged into contemporary prominence in the aftermath of World War I, as a response to what its proponents viewed as the naivete of classical liberal hopes for lasting peace through institutions and norms. Classical realism begins from the same foundational premise as neoliberalism. The international system is anarchic in nature. There is no overarching authority capable of enforcing rules between states. But modern realists draw a different conclusion. Because survival is at stake, power, both military and economic, becomes the central currency of international politics. Might, in other words, makes right. Now, among contemporary realists, few figures have been more influential than our friend John Mearsheimer, the leading proponent of what is known as offensive realism. What's the difference between classical realism and offensive realism, you ask? Well, where classical realists argue that states seek security through power, offensive realists go a step further, arguing that the anarchic nature of the international system drives great powers to maximize power to ensure their survival and dominance, which in turn makes cooperation fragile and often a temporary tactic of positioning and posturing. The safest position in an anarchic system is not balance or even advantage, but hegemony. The safest place is to be the most powerful actor in your region without peer competitors. Mearsheimer then does not deny that culture or ideology or legitimacy matter. What he rejects is the claim that these forces operate independently of material hard power. From an offensive realist's perspective, attraction does not generate power. Power generates the conditions under which attraction becomes possible. Which is to say, the United States is not the best at soft power, nor even number one at soft power. It's the best at hard power, and the attraction is secondary to and structured by and even forced by the underlying material hard power. And this distinction becomes critical when we turn to the Cold War. In the United States, the Cold War is often taught in schools as a battle for hearts and minds, one that the US won without direct conquest as per Joseph Nye. But from an offensive realist perspective, this framing mistakes the outcome for the cause. The question isn't whether American culture appears attractive, but whether that attraction can exist without a global system of military bases, covert interventions, economic coercion, and institutional control that underpins it. Because, in truth, the Cold War was hardly cold, and large-scale conflict emerged only a few short years after the Long Telegram. In 1950, the United States intervened militarily on the Korean Peninsula, marking the first major armed conflict of the post-war order. The war ended in a stalemate, with a divided peninsula, a permanent U.S. military presence, and a frozen conflict that persists to this very day. And one of those remnant states, South Korea, did not align with the United States because of cultural attraction or shared values. The South Korean people are utterly miserable, with 80% of the younger generation wishing to leave Korea, 80% of young people viewing South Korea as hell, and over 80% of younger and older people believing that people born into poverty can never compete with those born into wealth. The government is extremely corrupt. There's a joke in South Korea that goes something like this: why does every president pardon the previous president when they come into power? So that the president after them will pardon them too. I made a whole video on this topic, so I won't go back over every little detail, but South Korea and its government and its oligarchic chaebols persist because American power guarantees their survival. The attraction, or perhaps more accurately, the acquiescence, follows the force. South Korea could not choose differently, and Korea established a pattern that would repeat throughout the Cold War. Military force was used not to conquer but to stabilize environments favorable to American dominance, which was then subsequently normalized and reinforced by American soft power initiatives post hoc. America would vassalize instead of annex. Now, in the equal and opposite direction, North Korea was utterly destroyed by the United States and then sanctioned thereafter in a campaign that was nothing short of genocidal. Have you ever seen those memes that show North Korea at night compared to South Korea? Oh, North Korea under the tyrannical Kim regime is so backwards and economically incompetent why they can't even get electricity to their people. You want to know why North Korea has such poor power infrastructure and development? It's because we, the Americans, destroyed all of it. 18 out of 22 of North Korea's major cities were at least 50% destroyed as per Bruce Cummings' The Korean War, A History. Of those major cities, 4 were destroyed by the US Air Force's own estimates over 90%. The city of Sinanju was completely razed to the ground, with an assessment of 100% destruction. The American bombing campaign destroyed almost every single building in all of North Korea, and this included factories, power plants, schools, hospitals, government buildings, and civilian infrastructure. On May 13, 1953, the 58th Fighter Bomber Wing destroyed Toksan Dam, drowning Pyongyang. That same month, we continued by bombing Chasan Dam and then Kuwanga Dam, Namsi Dam, and Taechung Dam, which caused unbelievable damage, drowned many thousands of people, and swept away enormous swaths of valuable farmland. Around 15% of the entire North Korean population was killed during the war. And according to the United States, all of these obvious civilian structures were, and I quote, military targets. And then, after we reduced all of North Korea to literal mud huts, we sanctioned it, closing off North Korea's access to the global economy, causing mass starvation and continued struggle, which we then blame on our victims. And then we have the audacity to make memes about how they don't have lights.
And the North Koreans have suffered because the United States has done everything we possibly could to destroy the economy of North Korea. We've done everything we possibly could to destroy the economy of North Korea. We've done everything we possibly could to boost the economy of South Korea. And then we condemn them because they are backward and because their people are starving.
This is the other half of our Korean War lesson. After the war, in South Korea, American capital built and protected an allied order with investment, access to markets, treaties, and aid. In North Korea, we did the opposite. We destroyed any and all development in the country, we isolated it from the global economy, and then we treated the resulting poverty as proof that a rival system had failed on its own. If Korea then shows us what the open military intervention version of hard power looks like in the Cold War, the next question is, well, what does intervention look like when we don't send in the Marines? And for that, we have to talk about covert intervention and the CIA.
We caught an American CIA agent trying to subvert our intelligence special branch officer. Bribe him so that the special branch officer will feed the CIA, because the CIA wants to know what's happening. And I told the American government, all right, we keep quiet, you take this man away. $100 million to the Singapore government for economic development. You know? No, listen to me. I didn't tell, I never spoke to the Americans direct because, they lack the finesse, and they may say yes, they give it to you. Why not? Why should the Singapore government just give to you, to me, which would have ruined me? But through an intermediary, they offered me and my party $10 million. I mean, the insult, I told them, keep it.
The CIA did a lot of crazy stuff during the Cold War. We could go into all of it in detail, but this video's long enough as it is. Like, just the big interventions are enough for whole videos on their own. There's Operation PB Success in 1954, where the CIA overthrew the democratically elected president of Guatemala. There was the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, wherein the CIA attempted to invade Cuba. There was Project Camelot, wherein the CIA spent tons of effort and money from the 50s to the 70s trying to silence leftist Democratic candidates in Chile, contributing to the eventual military coup which put the brutal dictator Augusto Pinochet in power. These examples kind of go against the rhetoric that all nations who joined with the United States did so due to attraction or soft power, doesn't it? The choice wasn't join with the United States or with the Soviet Union, it was join with the United States or face the constant, never-ending bombardment of CIA destabilization, military pressure or outright invasion, and economic sanction, which we'll get to. Though there are many examples of CIA destabilization, let's focus in on one particularly relevant example of how American hard power operates and how soft power alone is simply insufficient where hard power fails.
Even with your enemies, even with your adversaries, I do think that you have to have the capacity to put yourself occasionally in their shoes. And if you look at Iranian history, the fact is that we had some involvement with overthrowing a democratically elected regime in Iran.
On April 28, 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was elected as the Prime Minister of Iran. Now, Mossadegh was extremely popular. He'd won the election through massive public support on a message of ending the exploitation of foreign actors in Iranian affairs. Mossadegh pursued many popular reforms, such as introducing unemployment compensation and forcing factory owners to pay benefits to sick and injured workers. But Mossadegh's primary mission was to end foreign control of Iranian oil, which came about due to concessions made to the British by the reigning monarchs, the Shahs of Iran. In March of 1951, Iran nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British-controlled firm that had long dominated Iran's oil industry, which generated enormous profit but which returned only a small fraction of wealth back to Iran. In response, the British attempted to impose an embargo and blockade of Iran and lodged complaints against Iran before the United Nations Security Council. The British government threatened legal action against purchasers of oil produced by Iranian refineries. And in secret, MI6, the British intelligence service, plotted to remove Mossadegh from power. But the British lacked hard power. They simply couldn't muster the economic or military or covert force necessary to directly hurt Iran. And so they turned to whom else but the United States. By 1952, the situation in Iran had deteriorated severely. Although the British embargo had weakened the economy, and though political divisions had deepened, Mossadegh was increasingly consolidating his power in an attempt to combat Western undermining of his efforts. And in this moment of relative weakness, the British and their American allies saw an opportunity. The very next year, in March of 1953, the CIA formally began its plot to overthrow Mossadegh. By early June of that year, the plan was ready. It was called Operation Ajax. Operation Ajax had three core objectives. The first was to remove Mossadegh. The second was to strengthen the position of the West's puppet leader, the Shah. And the third was to prevent any intrusions of influence by the Soviet Union. Use force to lock out enemy soft power. To that end, the CIA encouraged and outright bribed the Shah, one Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, to issue a decree dismissing Mossadegh, which ultimately failed, forcing the Shah to flee to Italy. Despite that initial failure, the CIA tried again, this time by literally bribing protesters, creating fake mobs which were used to manufacture violence, forcing a violent response from the government which left hundreds dead. That sounds kind of familiar, right? This violent smokescreen was then utilized by CIA-backed pro-monarchy loyalists, led by retired Army General Fazlollah Zahedi, who stormed the capital, overwhelmed Mossadegh's troops, and eventually arrested him. The Shah was thereafter returned to power, and Zahedi was appointed Prime Minister. And the Shah and Zahedi did what any good Western puppet leaders should. They agreed to restore the flow of Iranian oil to world markets in substantial quantities. And in so doing, they gave control of Iranian oil over to the British and the Americans, changing the name of the old Anglo-Iranian oil company to none other than British Petroleum. That's right, BP, everyone's favorite catastrophic environmental disaster of a company, was founded on stolen Iranian oil. But in Iran, the decision was extremely unpopular. It was so unpopular that the new government feared being overthrown itself. So under pressure from the United States, BP accepted membership in a consortium of oil companies which would work together to bring Iranian oil back into the market. This consortium coalesced in the form of a holding company called Iranian Oil Participants Ltd, or IOP. And the founding members of the IOP included British Petroleum, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, Total Energies, Chevron, Exxon, Mobil, and Texaco. The West would have its pound of flesh and extract Iran's wealth for itself while obfuscating the exploitation as much as it could. But from the outside, all of this looks like soft power, doesn't it? Consider the narrative a Western media consumer might encounter. A popular demagogue seizes power from our noble ally, the Shah of Iran. And this usurper immediately tries to take the oil wealth for himself. But his decision hurts his country so much that his people rise up and the dictator kills a bunch of innocent protesters until the people overthrow him and they reappoint our friend the Shah and reinstate their democratic system. Now, finally, the women are free and the children can breathe easy. The Iranian people love freedom and democracy, and free trade is what is fed to the outside world. But the internal mechanisms that fueled the coup from the top down were hard power interventions pursued for Western control over Iran's natural resources against the will of the Iranian people. And because the soft power pro-Western stability of Iran was built on but an illusion produced by hard power, when the United States blinked and turned its hard power head away for but a moment, the system it had carefully constructed began to unravel. In the years following the 1953 coup, the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, whose dynasty remains an asset of U.S. intelligence, by the way, consolidated his power with the backing of the U.S. and the UK. Political opposition was suppressed and the regime turned to its own intelligence apparatus, the infamous secret police organization SAVAK, to monitor and silence dissenters.
Are you aware of a CIA psychological profile about you, sir?
No, I must admit that it's the first time I hear that.
Truly?
Yes? What is it?
Would you be interested in hearing what the CIA had to say?
Yes, why not?
Really?
Yes, why not?
I have your permission?
Yes, sure.
You won't send me to the SAVAK if I ask?
No, I would spare you this terrible ordeal of going through torture.
This secret study portrays the Shah as a brilliant but dangerous megalomaniac who is likely to pursue his own aims in disregard of U.S. interests.
So how could I be your man, your agent?
The Shah also undertook a massive westernization effort known as the White Revolution. The goal of the White Revolution was simple. The peasants and working class were getting crushed under the corrupt system as it existed, and alleviating some pressure through land reform without substantially improving their conditions or bargaining power might ease their frustrations enough to stave off a communist revolution. It was meant to be a revolution without blood, hence the White Revolution. But genuine revolutionary change cannot come from above, and the Shah's revolution was not aligned with the interests of the people. Sure, the White Revolution substantially improved literacy rates, it expanded women's rights, improved essential infrastructure, and grew the economy. But the economic growth was fundamentally uneven. Oil wealth became concentrated once again in the hands of the few, and often the foreign. Urban elites who supported this liberal economic system reaped the profits, while most others suffered its consequences. As Ervan Abrahamian, distinguished professor of history at Baruch College, states, the White Revolution had been designed to preempt a Red Revolution. Instead, it paved the way for an Islamic Revolution. This anger culminated in a revolutionary figurehead emerging in the form of Ayatollah Khomeini, a Twelver Shia cleric who voiced his dissent at the Shah in 1963 by declaring him, and I quote, a wretched, miserable man who embarked on the path toward destruction of Islam in Iran. The Shah, in response, knowing that Khomeini couldn't just be assassinated for fear of revolution, arrested him instead. Yet even just the act of arrest, however, caused 3 days of riots to follow in which as many as 15,000 protesters were killed as a result of police aggression. After 8 months of house arrest, Khomeini was freed and he continued his agitation, only to be rearrested and exiled in November of 1964 to Bursa, Turkey. What followed was a period of apparent relative calm. Oil wealth grew, and from the outside, Iran appeared both modern and prosperous. Have you ever seen those comparison photos of Iranian women before and after the Islamic Revolution? Well, Western clothes and values, the apparent results of soft power, were backed by and enforced through exceptionally unpopular American hard power. There was massive economic inequality, very limited political participation, and SAVAK, the secret police backed by American intelligence, continued to brutally silence opposition. The surface once again looks like an American cultural victory, but that cultural victory is only a veneer atop an ongoing economic, intelligence, and military operation. The facade was quite amenable to Western observers. Only the very few and very wealthy reaped those benefits while everyone else toiled to support their lifestyles. Those people didn't matter to the Shah because they had no wealth and no power. Look, for the Shah, for his pro-Western regime, an uneducated populace is simply easier to rule. The wealthy get to act like Westerners and get education. They get the benefits of foreign exploitation of their countrymen. But the normal people receive no benefit. There's a reason why the Islamic Republic still exists and enjoys substantial legitimacy in Iran despite Western narratives to the contrary. There's also a reason why the Iranian diaspora in the West tends to be so anti-Islamic Republic. Their families were the wealthy pro-Western families. If you are interested in learning more about the Islamic Republic of Iran, by the way, I highly recommend former British diplomat Alistair Crook's book, Resistance: The Essence of Islamic Revolution. In any case, the oppression and inequality reached a breaking point in the late 70s when a series of mysterious deaths amongst leading outspoken Islamist figures in Iran led to protests. As the protests then grew out of control, the Shah attempted to negotiate with the protesters, promising full democratic elections, relaxed censorship, and reduced corruption. But the Iranian people had already experienced the White Revolution. They understood that meaningful change cannot come from the top down, because the powerful will always be primarily self-interested and not be willing to concede as much as the people require to survive. Thus, protests continued and were violently quashed until the population could take no more. In 1987, nationwide strikes shut down the production of the Iranian oil industry, and by late October of that year, a general strike was declared. The Shah was paralyzed. If he shut down the protests, they would emerge in greater force. If he left them alone, they would continue to grow as well. The military leadership followed along with the Shah's indecision, and so when Khomeini called for the military to defect, deserters abandoned the military in droves. By December of 1978, the situation in Iran had become so untenable that the Carter administration considered pulling its support of the Shah, developing a plan instead to create a sort of pro-Western military junta, with Khomeini installed as a puppeted spiritual leader. But officials in the Carter administration also disagreed with each other, and thus no decision was finally reached. On January 16, 1979, the Shah and his family fled to Egypt, even as American General Robert Heusser, the deputy commander of U.S. European Command, entered Iran to discuss the possibility of a pro-Shah coup with Iran's military leaders. But that never came to fruition. With the Shah officially out, two rival governments established themselves. The first was the government of Shapur Bakhtiar, who was chosen specifically by the Shah to help in the creation of a civilian government. And then there was the revolutionary government of Ayatollah Khomeini. By February of that same year, however, it had become clear that Bakhtiar's government lacked the support of the people. And by February 11th, the Ayatollah's rebel forces, supported by Islamist Marxist guerrillas, had overthrown the provisional civil government, which in turn marks the founding of the Islamic Republic of Iran. If soft power had been enough on its own to secure the loyalty of Iran, if short dresses and blue jeans, if rock music and fast food, if the trappings of consumerism had been sufficient by their own merits, then there wouldn't have been a revolution the second the Americans dropped their guard. In truth, the trappings of American soft power, as we have seen, as we will continue to see, and as we are observing in the present, were and are held together by extraordinary repression and gratuitous use of hard power. But there is one more weapon in the American hard power arsenal that we must discuss, and it is arguably the most sinister of all for both its ease of use and its deadliness. I am referring to the single American weapon which has killed more people than any other: the economic sanction.
As I said to you before, I think that we are an incredibly ruthless country. The amount of murder and mayhem that we've created around the world is just unbelievable. You know, I was looking at a study the other day put out by Lancet, which is a scientific journal, and they did a study. This was put out, you can see it on the internet. It was put out in November of 2025. And what the article did was it looked at sanctions, American sanctions, from 1971 to 2021. 1971 to 2021. And it asked what were the consequences of those sanctions. And we murdered 38 million people. 38 million people.
We in the West, for whatever reason, are obsessed with numbers of death and casualties in wars and atrocities. I once had a good Jewish friend of mine teach me this important lesson. Deaths by war, by genocide, by famine, these things are counted in numbers, but they're not meant to be compared in numbers. It's not a contest, it's not a race. All of it, all of these atrocities are terrible. But in the typical Western mindset, we kind of consider some forms of genocide and atrocity worse than others, don't we? The Holocaust needs no introduction. Around 17 million people were killed by Nazi Germany. In the West, we look at the deaths of the Great Leap Forward, wherein China attempted to combat a history of terrible famine, and we tend to blame every single element of that transitionary period on the singular policies of Mao Zedong, tallying up 35 million deaths to his name. And yet, when we in the West impose famine on others, not trying to fix old problems but to purposefully create new ones, we suddenly don't care enough to count. And when others count for us, well, we consider the price they pay in their blood worth it.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
We think the price was worth it. That was Madeleine Albright, who served as Secretary of State under President Bill Clinton, speaking during an interview in 1996 on the matter of sanctions, while she was still serving as the American ambassador to the United Nations. 500,000 dead Iraqi children. To do what? To end the regime of Saddam Hussein and to prevent his development of so-called weapons of mass destruction? The same regime we put into power in the first place, and the same regime we ended up toppling by force of arms a decade later in an alleged search for those same weapons which were never found. We killed multiple nuclear detonations worth of people in Iraq, literally starving them to death, only to invade anyway and cause an additional million in excess deaths. And to Madeleine Albright, to Bill Clinton, to our Western allies in the United Nations, the price of achieving absolutely nothing was worth millions of Iraqi dead. Because in their inhumane and monstrous calculus, those Iraqi men, women, and children are worth nothing, and 0 minus 0 is 0. 500,000 may as well have been 5 million, may as well have been 5 billion. The number of dead doesn't matter to them. What matters to them is the primacy of American hard power, the dominance of the American hegemony no matter the cost. Now, when we think of the economic sanction, we often think it works something like this. Let's say you're North Korea. You're a communist country which we think is wrong and you're threatening our ally, South Korea. Thus, to punish your behavior, we will prohibit Americans, American companies, American banks, and anyone inside of U.S. jurisdiction from doing business with you. This is called a primary sanction. But sanctions often go much further. You can also say anyone who trades with you will also not be able to trade with us. And because everyone wants to trade with us, nobody trades with you, and thus you are economically squeezed to death. This is called a secondary sanction, and it's possible because of just how integral the United States is to the global economy by design. On July 1st, 1944, a gathering of 730 delegates from all 44 nations of the Allies met at Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to discuss the post-war international monetary and financial order. The global economy was thought to be partially responsible for both world wars, you see, and thus an organized international economic order could hopefully lead to a rising tide that lifts all boats. And on July 22nd, the Allies walked away with a few major agreements in place. The first agreement was the creation of the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, which was meant to monitor exchange rates and lend money to nations with economic problems. The second agreement then after the IMF was the creation of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, which later became the foundation for what we call the World Bank. With most of Europe and Asia having been ravaged by war, the IBRD was supposed to help finance the rebuilding effort and eventually also assist in the development of poorer countries. When the IBRD comes with development money, though, who decides what gets built? Who decides what economic model gets put in place and what kind of society gets encouraged? Well, the Americans do, and to top it all off, if you want to join the IBRD, you are also required to join the IMF. And this gets tied together by the third major agreement of Bretton Woods, the Final Act, which built the entire global economy around the US dollar. Member countries had to peg their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to the price of gold at $35 per ounce. So let's say that your currency is the Hylian rupee, and you have 4 Hylian rupees that equals $1. If your currency rises too much in value, the Central Bank of Hyrule can sell its own currency to buy dollars to push the value of the rupee back down. You will note then that while the rules as written allowed America vast amounts of control over the global economy, there was still a check in place. As long as the dollar was tied to gold, the United States couldn't just create infinite dollars without consequences. If the United States prints too many dollars and foreign governments come a-knocking to swap their dollars out for gold, you have to have enough gold to swap, or the faith in the dollar collapses and with it, the global economy. You can kind of imagine what happened next then. When the checks became inconvenient, the United States simply ignored them. The Vietnam War, you see, had become prohibitively expensive, and with so many dollars circulating, the world began to wonder if the US really had enough gold to cover its currency. In response to those concerns, then, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the US would suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold, and then issued a 10% surcharge on imports, in other words, a tariff, an event known as the Nixon shock. The US economy boomed in response and the global economy shrank. Now, the US dollar was at the center of global finance without any checks and apparently without any substantial blowback or consequences. The US was simply too powerful militarily and economically. And we all live in the reality of that decision in the post-Bretton Woods financial system. With the dollar and thus currencies around the world no longer tied to gold, exchange rates began to float freely, and in that environment, finance became much more important. Currencies move, and thus interest rates move, and thus capital moves. And where capital moves, profits can be made. Think of it like this. Where does a nation's economic power come from? Well, traditionally one might say the workers, the peasant farming the land, or the laborer in the factory. Maybe also through trade. What the worker produces can be bought and sold, where that good is scarce, fulfilling the dynamics of supply and demand. But in a financialized system, economic power becomes primarily exercised through instruments like bonds or loans or securities. Which is to say, your economic power comes from the manipulation of money and not the production and distribution of goods. Put another way, you don't need to work in the factory if you own shares in the company that owns the factory, or if you own the debt of the company that owns the factory. You don't need to ship the goods if you finance the shipment, if you insure the cargo vessel, if you process the payment or underwrite the loan. In a financialized world, then, a country cannot simply produce its way out of every problem. It needs access to the financial machinery upon which the global economy is designed to function. You can have oil, but if nobody can buy your oil, nobody can ship your oil, nobody can insure your ships, and nobody's willing to handle the payment transaction for the sale, then the economic power of having even a valuable resource like oil is greatly diminished. You might see where this is going then. Let's say you're in, Brazil, and you want to buy a rare book from Malaysia. The book never crosses into American territory, but it's very likely that the payment is denominated in US dollars as opposed to reais or ringgit. You trigger your bank then to send $100 to to the Malaysian seller, but your Brazilian bank cannot just create USD out of thin air. Instead, it holds a dollar account with a larger bank that has access to the US banking system, and the Malaysian bank likewise does something similar. To complete the payment, then, the banks exchange instructions and adjust balances between their dollar accounts in a process known as dollar clearing. And once your transaction touches upon the American financial system, the US has leverage over you and your transaction. Consider OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, which administers and enforces many of America's sanctions. If OFAC places a person or a company or a bank on its sanctions list, broadly speaking, Americans can't do business with them and their property in the US can be frozen. But what can also happen is other institutions like banks who don't want to lose access to dollar clearing or pay massive fines for violating sanctions rules will also decide that compliance risk isn't worth it, and thus refuse to process transactions related to the sanctioned entity. So imagine the same scenario, but one party is sanctioned. Even if the sanction doesn't touch upon your transaction, even if America isn't directly involved, by proxy of coercive force, the banks may be too afraid to process your transaction. In other words, if you don't please America, your entire economy struggles to buy and sell stuff. America makes you financially radioactive, deadly to even interact with. I know this is a lot to take in. This section was originally both twice as long and totally cut at different points, but I felt the context was too important. There's a lot more we could discuss here, from the petrodollar to offshore eurodollar banking to SWIFT to Fed swap lines, but this isn't economics explained. Ultimately, we only need enough context to digest how powerful sanctions actually are as weapons. To observe how sanctions work as hard power then, and how soft power fails when hard power fails in this circumstance, let's narrow our scope to a specific case study by returning to the nation of Cuba.
Cuando las tropas surafricanas avanzaban a 70 kilómetros por día desde Namibia.
On December 10, 1898, the United States and Spain signed the Treaty of Paris, wherein, amongst other concessions, Spain renounced all rights to Cuba, thus ending the Spanish-American War. The United States, however, was not about to let Cuba just walk free, despite ostensibly fighting the war in part for Cuban independence. Cuba was placed under American military rule, which would only be lifted in 1902, after Cuba agreed to the 8 provisions of the Platt Amendment. Cuba surrendered its military, diplomatic, territorial, and financial sovereignty and agreed that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Cuban politics at any time for the quote-unquote maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. By 1926, just 25 years after the Platt Amendment, U.S. companies owned 60% of the Cuban sugar industry, and the U.S. imported 95% of that Cuban crop. The arrangement had predictable consequences. Cuba's economy was heavily dependent on a single export, which is to say sugar, and that export was controlled in large part by exclusively American interests. And this economic imbalance was maintained by a corrupt American-backed government, which in turn was deeply unpopular amongst its people. This in turn led to the government of Gerardo Machado being overthrown by a genuine popular revolt. A US-backed provisional government was hastily put in place, but that quickly fell apart, and Machado's first legitimate replacement, Ramon Grau, immediately nullified the Platt Amendment upon assuming the presidency. In a panicked response, U.S. Ambassador to Cuba Sumner Welles requested U.S. military intervention, and President Franklin Delano Good Neighbor Policy Roosevelt himself ordered 29 warships to Cuba, alerted the Marines, and prepared bombers. The intervention, however, proved unnecessary. The message had been sent, and Grau's government, starved of recognition, was vulnerable. The United States tapped the head of the military, one Fulgencio Batista, and together they forced Grau to resign, replacing Grau with a puppet president, Carlos Mendieta, with Batista in the shadows as the true ruler of Cuba and the United States standing behind him. Batista ruled Cuba from the 30s until the early 50s. The Batista era saw Cuba's economy come under nearly complete American control, with corruption rife in government and with Havana becoming notorious as a den for American organized crime. As U.S. Ambassador to Cuba Arthur Gardner puts it, and I quote, "Batista had always leaned towards the United States. I don't think we ever had a better friend. It was regrettable, like all South Americans, that he was known to be getting a cut, I think is the word for it, in almost all the things that were done. But on the other hand, he was doing an amazing job. This so-called amazing job came to an end when the Cuban people could finally take no more of Batista's corruption and America's extraction. In July of 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro led a group of revolutionaries on a failed attack against the Batista government. Castro was taken prisoner and the revolution appeared to fail. But the anger of the Cuban people was only building pressure. In hopes of alleviating some of that pressure, in 1955, Batista released many of his captured political prisoners in an act of amnesty, backed by the United States and major corporations. And to make a long story short, this culminated in a genuine successful revolution, with Castro and his forces overthrowing Batista on January 1st, 1959. The United States attempted to first make good with this new Cuban administration, hoping that it could win over the administration with its original tricks, with bribery and corruption. But Castro's government, organized around genuine revolutionary principles, morals, and values that extended beyond mere capital accumulation, failed to concede to American interests. In their hearts, there was something greater than mere wealth accumulation. Cuba began to implement agrarian reforms and nationalized many of the industries once owned by American interests. And as Cuba unshackled itself from American exploitation, the Americans grew displeased. The U.S. then imposed its first economic sanctions on Cuba, hoping to injure growing Cuban sovereignty. First, the U.S. canceled the sugar quota. Sugar was Cuba's primary export, you see, and the U.S. was its main buyer. Without sugar exports, the U.S. thought, the Cuban economy would collapse and a new revolution would rise up to overthrow Castro's government. These initial sanctions were followed by export restrictions. All exports from the U.S. to Cuba were banned save for food and medicine. Cuba would no longer have the tools of industry necessary to build a country. Just like with the Megarian Decree, however, these sanctions backfired, and the Cubans responded by nationalizing even more formerly U.S.-owned businesses, while also expanding their ties with the Soviet Union, which in turn led to the full U.S. embargo of Cuba, which began in 1962, not long after the CIA attempted Bay of Pigs invasion. All trade with Cuba was banned, with imports and exports completely cut off. Cuba was also cut off from the global financial system. The US then mobilized its hard power squeeze to push its allies to follow its sanctions, turning Cuba into a regional trade pariah as well. And long after the Cold War ended, to this very day, Cuba continues to be under withering sanctions which deprive the island nation of fuel, natural resources, and access to global markets. In 2023, the United Nations estimated that the total economic damage to the Cuban economy was in the trillions of dollars since the inception of the embargo. Despite these long decades of sustained economic pressure, despite the American-imposed economic dysfunction, however, Cuba has been able to persevere. Cuba has, for example, with its limited resources, been able to invest heavily into biotechnology and pharmaceutical research, developing pioneering vaccines and cancer treatments domestically. Consider this. In 2015, Cuba became the first country in the world to eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV and syphilis, as validated by the World Health Organization. Cuba demonstrates to us how the reach of soft power is limited by the reach of hard power. Where hard power could not produce compliance, not through intervention, nor military invasion, nor economic coercion, soft power also failed to gain a foothold. Soft power does exist, as we stated, but in this case it exists largely within hard power boundaries and geopolitical realities. What about, however, situations in which economic coercion does succeed because the hard power fundamentals are in place? Consider Japan in the 1980s. In 1985, the US pressured Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK into agreeing to push the value of the dollar down against their currencies, including the yen, thereby making American exports more competitive. For Japan in particular, this was a terrible deal, but the Japanese could not refuse, as failing to agree would result in trade war with the United States. The yen appreciated dramatically, Japanese exporters came under pressure, and the Japanese response inflated an asset bubble, the collapse of which led into the lost decades, which persists, by the way, to this very day. The dollar giveth, and the dollar taketh away. Cuba shows us what happens when economic coercion fails against an enemy outside of the American order. Japan shows us what happens when economic coercion succeeds against an ally inside of it. But both examples point us back to the same place. American economic power is strongest where American military and political power have already structured the field, and American soft power arrives downstream of them all. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, let's return to the most visible form of hard power, in military intervention. What are the consequences? What happens to soft power when military intervention itself finally fails?
You know, there's lots of things you expect in war. Carnage, the sleepless nights. But what they don't prepare you for is the incessant use of Fortunate Son.
Vietnam is often remembered as the moment when American media finally turned against state narratives, when the great moral awakening of journalism occurred. In this version of events, the outcome of the war serves as proof of the free press's ideological superiority, that liberal media possesses an internal corrective which over time favors exposure and not enforced consensus. And this interpretation is frequently invoked by neoliberal institutionalists who point to Vietnam as a demonstration of legitimacy succeeding over coercion, of open societies exposing their own failures and surviving while authoritarian systems collapse under the weight of enforced narrative. The American dream survived the failure of Vietnam, but the Soviets didn't survive Afghanistan, right? This is proof that our system works. But let's hold on a moment and observe the Vietnam War more closely. By the early 1960s, anti-communism was the organizing force of American political legitimacy. There was McCarthyism, the Red Scare, which treated communist thought as a virus that could infect your co-workers, friends, and loved ones with anti-Americanism. A person could have their reputation torpedoed, their careers ruined, not even necessarily for being communists, but for not being anti-communist enough. Nobody needed to be instructed to frame communist expansion as a threat, nor did editors require pressure to portray American intervention as defensive in nature. As we discussed, the incentives were already in place, and the audience had already been conditioned through generations of political myth-making and institutional reinforcement to understand that America and its professed values were exceptional and morally sacrosanct. And the Vietnam War was at first processed through that same framework. American involvement was framed as limited and advisory, even as the United States military geared up for war. The American puppet state of South Vietnam was portrayed as flawed but necessary, even as the deeply corrupt regime of Ngo Dinh Diem pursued repression and sectarian favoritism, which generated growing popular discontent. It's a familiar pattern to us now, isn't it? Escalation and American intervention seemed inevitable. Let's go back in time a little bit, right? When the Japanese invaded the colony of French Indochina during World War II, it exposed to the Vietnamese people that the French were not invincible. As a result, the Vietnamese anti-colonial movements arose, ready to unshackle the nation itself once and for all from the imperial ambitions of foreign powers. And of these movements, the most significant was a Marxist-Leninist anti-colonial movement led by one Ho Chi Minh. In 1945, Ho declared Vietnam independent of French rule. But France was not ready to give up her colonial possession. What followed was the First Indochina War, which ended in a decisive French defeat in 1954 and the subsequent Geneva Conference, which partitioned Vietnam into two separate entities at the 17th parallel: the independent communist North Vietnam and the pro-Western South Vietnam. The intention was, eventually, that nationwide elections would be held and the country would be reunified. Those elections never happened, though. The United States, newly emergent as the dominant Western power, viewed the ongoing war through its strategy for the Cold War, which is to say, containment. Communism, the strategy proposed, as we discussed, had to be prevented from expanding beyond its existing borders. Vietnam then was not important because of the territory of Vietnam per se, but because of what it represented, the first domino in what American policymakers came to call the domino theory. If Vietnam falls to communism, all of Southeast Asia might too, thereby undermining American credibility. American involvement in Vietnam crept in slowly. Familiar song and dance, right? First, in the 1950s, there was financial aid, military advisors, and political backing for the pro-Western government of South Vietnam.
At this time, however, the Americans in Vietnam are there only as advisors. There are no United States combat units as such.
By the early 1960s, so-called American military advisors had grown in number to the tens of thousands. And by the summer of 1964, American involvement in Vietnam had already grown to the point where conflict seemed inevitable. Even as the American public believed that U.S. troops were in Vietnam merely to keep the peace, the military had already shifted its planning from support to outright engagement. All that remained was a casus belli, a cause for war, capable of aligning public framing and strategic intentions. Thus, on August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy destroyer USS Maddox reported an engagement with North Vietnamese patrol boats in the Gulf of Tonkin. 2 days later, on August 4th, the Johnson administration announced that a second attack had occurred, this time both unprovoked and in international waters. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. The second attack, it turns out, never happened, by the way. Now, ostensibly, internal communications inside the government reflected some uncertainty. Radio signals were ambiguous, and sonar readings were inconsistent, and the weather was poor, and doubts emerged as to whether any attack had actually occurred at all. But the uncertainty didn't really matter. The war had already been decided on and declared well before the public was made aware of it or any vote was cast. On August 7th, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution with near unanimity, granting the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia without a formal declaration of war. The resolution did not specify limits, objectives, or duration. It effectively outsourced Congress's constitutional war-making authority to the executive branch. Initial coverage treated the government's account as authoritative, with headlines echoing the official language, while editorials emphasized restraint while endorsing the response. The ambiguity of the evidence underlying the call to war was acknowledged, but as a matter of secondary concern. Despite the flimsy moral reasoning, around 59% of Americans were in favor of the war at its outset. American airstrikes began and then intensified. Troop deployments surged. The military-industrial complex was unshackled, operating at massive scale with a staggering indifference to human life. During World War II, the United States dropped a total of 2,150,000 tons of bombs in all theaters of the war. During the Vietnam War, around 7,662,000 tons of explosives were dropped. That's nearly 4 times the amount. Horrifying chemical weapons like Agent Orange were deployed, which obliterated the environment and caused devastating long-term effects to Vietnamese civilian populations in the form of cancers and birth defects. An extreme war of attrition was waged, with the assumption that American industrial might would eventually exhaust our primitive enemy. But the enemy refused to break, for while the Americans fought against communism, the Vietnamese were not fighting for communism. They were fighting for independence, for freedom. Freedom from France, freedom from Japan, and freedom from the United States. And as the costs mounted and escalation failed to produce resolution, the gap between the official framing and material reality widened beyond repair. The hard power failed first. On January 15, 1973, the United States suspended all combat activities in Vietnam. And on April 30, 1975, Vietnamese forces captured the capital of the pro-Western regime, marking the end of the Vietnam War. The United States had waged one of the most barbarous campaigns of war imaginable, committing innumerable war crimes against a people it had no business fighting, but for strategic goals of ideological containment that proved disconnected from local political realities. And it had achieved nothing. The war was immensely unpopular, with U.S. polling in 1978 revealing that 72% of Americans believed that the war was fundamentally immoral and wrong. The total cost of the war was nearly $2 trillion in today's dollars, and the legacy of the war continues to be felt even to this day in both Vietnam and here in the United States. Back at home, there were protests, and media coverage reflected the eroding of public trust. Faith in the government was fractured. The moral authority of the American state was openly questioned. As Secretary of Defense McNamara once wrote to President Johnson, the picture of the world's greatest superpower killing or seriously injuring 1,000 non-combatants a week while trying to pound a tiny backward nation into submission on an issue whose merits are hotly disputed is not a pretty one. Now there's this prevailing narrative in the United States that it is this unpretty image, it is the home front, that sank the war front. If the public hadn't been such pansies, we'd have eventually bowled over the North Vietnamese and won the war. But in Vietnam, like in Iran, like in Cuba, we see how soft power does not operate independently of hard power, but emerges instead downstream of it, contingent on the successful establishment of political order through hard power. The home front was lost because the war front was lost. The public opinion shifted because we failed in our hard power deployment. The failure of our hard power produced failure in our influence at home and weakening of it abroad. Consider, though, at the same time how our hard power was affecting other places around the world. Hard power during the Cold War remained decisive in Europe and Japan and Korea and other places where material reconstruction and security guarantees and institutional integration produced regimes that could be normalized and eventually internalized by their local populations, all of which came only after the successful application of hard power. Vietnam lacked those conditions. No amount of media coordination or cultural messaging could manufacture legitimacy for a regime that its own population experienced as imposed and corrupt. Where force did not succeed, neither thereafter could influence. The outcome of the Vietnam War reveals to us that without successful hard power, once again, the American model of soft power simply cannot follow. What then was the takeaway in Washington from this whole debacle? Well, I'll tell you what, it wasn't give peace a chance. It wasn't, well, maybe if we improve the material conditions of people, our system will look more enticing. No, the hegemonic superpower did what hegemonic superpowers always do. It sought new ways to use hard power to maintain its hegemony. The Vietnam War formally ended in 1975, and for a short time thereafter, the United States shied away from foreign conflict. In 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Resolution, which ostensibly prohibited the president from unilaterally sending the U.S. armed forces into action without Congress's statutory authorization, or in the case of a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. But remember that soft powers held together by hard power. And if America wanted to maintain its soft powers, the interventions could not stop. We saw what happened in Cuba, Iran, and now Vietnam. When American hard power flinches, its soft power collapses. So America started to lean away from the use of outright military invasion and leaned harder on the other two elements of hard power: economic coercion and clandestine operation. Consider this. From the moment the United States articulated the Monroe Doctrine, Central America had been treated less like a foreign territory and more like a special economic zone, a region where American power was presumed legitimate by default. There was the big stick policy and dollar diplomacy. And that's not imperialism. We're there to maintain order, right? By the late 1970s and 80s, however, the discontent of Central American peoples over their US-backed corrupt dictatorships boiled over into revolution. You will recall, for example, that the United States occupied Nicaragua from 1912 to 1933 during the Banana Wars. Well, after the occupation period, the United States installed a hereditary military dictatorship led by the Somoza family as a pro-American puppet government. Under the rule of the Somoza family, Nicaragua was faced with rising inequality and political corruption, and a government that prioritized the interests of American multinational corporations over those of its own people. Nothing new there, right? In the early 1980s, this outrage culminated in the Sandinista National Liberation Front, one of a handful of different leftist insurgencies that arose to challenge American-backed dictators throughout Central America. To American policymakers steeped in the rhetoric of the Cold War, this was intolerable, not because Nicaragua posed any kind of military threat, but because the revolution threatened American credibility. Not soft power credibility, but hard power credibility. A large-scale invasion, however, was politically impossible after Vietnam. An open-ended war would provoke backlash, and Congress, reflecting public exhaustion, explicitly prohibited funding for efforts to overthrow the Nicaraguan government through a series of restrictions called the Boland Amendments. But the president at the time, none other than Ronald Wilson Reagan, remained committed to defeating the Sandinistas and preserving the image of American hemispheric hegemony. With the law so against him, however, and the public so extremely united against further interventions in wars, well, Ronald Reagan had no choice. He just gave up and attempted to diplomatically. No, of course not. Reagan simply circumvented the law and ignored public opinion to exercise American hard power. The Reagan administration funded, trained, and provided weapons to counter-revolutionary, or Contra, militias fighting against the Sandinista government. But where would they get these funds? Congress would never approve of this, right? Well, with the assistance of the CIA, the Reagan administration secretly approved the sale of American weapons to our old friend, Iran, a country that on paper was officially an enemy of the United States and which was subject to an arms embargo. Now, the plan was simple. The CIA would secretly and unlawfully sell American weapons to Iran using the smokescreen of trying to free American hostages in Lebanon. They would then use that money to fund the Contras. It was foolproof. We would leverage our economic coercion using our intelligence apparatus and exercise our hard power without having to put boots on the ground. So Ronald Reagan sold weapons to a hostile state, violated America's own embargoes in the process, laundered the money, then used it to finance a war that nobody wanted and that Congress had expressly forbidden. This fiasco became known as the Iran-Contra affair. The operation was exposed in 1986 to much public outrage. Investigations were launched and General Oliver North was thrown under the bus, indicted, and then subsequently acquitted. The whole thing was framed as a scandal, a rogue operation by General North. But everyone got off scot-free. The plan had worked. What the Iran-Contra affair proved was that you could use hard power without any form of legitimacy whatsoever, so long as intervention remained plausibly deniable and was shielded from sustained public scrutiny. It could continue even in direct violation of the law. Intervention was a necessary element of American hegemony, and thus the use of hard power sat de facto above the law, above Congress, and above the people. Iran-Contra, then, far from being an aberration, far from being a scandal, became a prototype for American intervention for the decades to come. Consider, for example, Operation Cyclone, one of the longest and most expensive covert operations in history. Through the CIA, and primarily by proxy via the Pakistani intelligence service, the United States funneled weapons, funding, and training to Afghan insurgent groups fighting the Soviet Union. Ayatollahs in Iran, Russians in Afghanistan, right? In the Soviet-Afghan War, no American troops were deployed, no war was declared, no congressional authorization was sought. The war was fought by proxies and largely invisible to the American public. Instead, the public was fed a narrative of brave Mujahideen fighters standing up against Soviet aggression. The very same brave Mujahideen fighters, it turns out, didn't exactly appreciate America either, but that comes later. Over the course of the 80s, the Soviet Union was drawn into a grinding asymmetric conflict that drained its resources and eroded its national morale. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew in an embarrassing defeat, and just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. This outcome is often narrated as a failure of Soviet legitimacy, of the USSR losing the confidence of its people and crumbling under its own contradictions. But note the order of operations, right? The Soviet Union didn't lose legitimacy first and then suffer defeat. It suffered sustained material pressure, military exhaustion, economic collapse, and then legitimacy failure came afterwards. The soft power here could not survive without the hard power backing it up. And that hard power includes military and economy. Operation Cyclone then seemed to represent a successful resolution of the Vietnam problem. The United States had learned how to bleed an enemy while keeping political costs at length, or so it thought. But as the 1980s ended, the world changed yet again. The Soviet bloc was collapsing and the Cold War order was coming apart. The United States was already the leader of the free world, and with no other world but the free world, why, the US was de facto king of the world. And under those conditions, hard power no longer needed to be so subtle. Which begs the question, how will the United States behave in a world without rivals, where its dollar is God and its word is law? It was in Panama, then, that the United States saw an opportunity and an answer. You see, since the construction of the Panama Canal in the early 1900s, the country, like much of Central America, but even more so, functioned less like a sovereign state and more like a logistical artery of U.S. global dominance. The CIA maintained deep ties with Panamanian leadership, including one Manuel Noriega, a, you guessed it, military strongman who had long cooperated with the U.S. as an asset. When Noriega ceased his compliance, though, and began asserting autonomy and threatening canal security, President George H.W. Bush launched Operation Just Cause in December of 1989. Now you know where the video game's name comes from. In any case, more than 27,000 troops were deployed in an invasion of Panama. The Panamanian Defense Forces collapsed within days, and Noriega was captured, transported to the United States, tried, and imprisoned. The entire operation lasted mere weeks. And as a result, there was no legitimacy crisis at home, no draft, no prolonged occupation, no troubles. Media coverage framed the invasion as mere law enforcement rather than war. A police action to restore order, protect democracy, and uphold international norms. Moving forward, America was to be the global police, and our military, our sanctions, our intelligence were medicine for a sick world. The great game was over, and America was the winner. In 1989, a few months prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall and Operation Just Cause, political scientist and international relations scholar Francis Fukuyama published an essay arguing that with the final defeat of fascism and communism, there was no longer any serious competition for liberal democracy in the market economy. In the realm of ideas, said Fukuyama, liberalism had won, and since there were no longer any competitors, it was only a matter of time before liberal democracy and market economy spread throughout the world. What remains of history will be peaceful, boring even, Pax Americana, the great and final age where the only puzzles left to solve are those of, quote, economic calculation, the endless solving of technical problems, environmental concerns, and the satisfaction of sophisticated consumer demands. In hindsight, well, this all seems to be pretty quaint, doesn't it? But at the time, people genuinely believed this to be true. As hard as it is for many of my younger viewers to imagine, in the 90s, people by and large genuinely believed that the world was getting better day by day and that a brighter future was on its way for all of humanity. America just needed to keep things stable, to keep the bad actors in line and protect the status quo. In 1990, for example, following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, the United States assembled a broad international coalition and launched the Gulf War. The war was swift, it was effective, it was decisive, and it was very one-sided. In a matter of weeks, Iraqi forces were expelled from Kuwait and American casualties were minimal. The war had a clear objective and a satisfying conclusion. No single country on earth could challenge the liberal democratic free market American system or it would meet the same fate as Iraq. And throughout the 90s, the United States continued to intervene, always for the stated intention of protecting democracy and international norms. History's great ideological struggles truly appeared over, and all that remained was management. But the cracks were already there. The system had not, in fact, eliminated conflict, nor had it resolved its internal contradictions. And the United States, in its position of unchallenged dominance, imagined itself invincible and unassailable. If you watched my videos in the past, you know that I am a native New Yorker. I was here on September 11th, 2001. I remember the events of that day vividly. I remember the panic in people's faces, the fear of my own family, and the quiet relief that everyone was okay. I remember the scent of the chalky ash that coated every building, every car, everything. That sweet, sickly smell. And I remember the emotions of that day, the horror, followed by astonishment, then sorrow, then anger. And the feelings kept flashing back and forth until only anger remained. We must do something to prevent this from ever happening again. We must strike back. The desire to fight back is only natural when your world, once peaceful, is shaken by violence to its very core. And thus, whenever we Americans or one of our allies bombs innocent civilians, which in turn causes the rise of violent resistance groups, I ironically perhaps, remember 9/11 and my own sorrow, confusion, and anger. In a twisted way, that's kind of what Osama bin Laden wanted all along. He wanted in part for Americans to experience what we'd been putting others through for 2 centuries. He wanted us to suffer as the world has suffered at our hands. But what we Americans took away from 9/11 was not stop bombing civilians because look how it feels. It was now more than ever we must be as American as possible. And that wave of extreme nationalism manifested itself in new wars of foreign aggression against a new and ultimately insurmountable enemy. Not Osama bin Laden, not his home base of Afghanistan, and not his sponsors in Saudi Arabia, but the nebulous concept of terror. In October of 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan, targeting bin Laden's Al-Qaeda and the Taliban government that harbored them. At first, the war appeared to go well. The Taliban government quickly fell, Allied forces captured the city of Kabul by November, the last city under Taliban control, Kandahar, fell on December 9th. But bin Laden was nowhere to be found, and it was thought that he might be hiding in the mountainous border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, in one of the many caves of the Tora Bora mountain range. And as the conflict dragged on, the priorities began to shift as American hard power failed to bring about the expected results. The war started with the goal of dismantling Al-Qaeda and bringing bin Laden to justice. It evolved then into stabilizing Afghanistan, and from there to rebuilding Afghanistan in an American model and then protecting that new Afghan government from collapse. But, as many of you likely lived through, the American empire was not satisfied with a petty victory in Afghanistan. Let's return to the Gulf War for a moment. After the liberation of Kuwait, the US declared that its objectives had been achieved and that the war was a success. What the US did not do, however, was invade the capital of Iraq, Baghdad, and remove its leader, Saddam Hussein. Instead, the US tried to get the Iraqi people to remove Saddam Hussein, in part through clandestine operations, but also through vicious sanctions, no-fly zones, and periodic airstrikes. Despite all of that, though, Saddam Hussein remained stubbornly in power. By the late 90s, frustration with the status quo was growing inside of Washington. For example, the Project for the New American Century, we'll call it PNAC, a neoconservative think tank based in D.C., wrote an open letter in 1998 to then-President Bill Clinton, calling for the removal of Saddam Hussein by military force. This letter was signed by such notable neoconservatives as Robert Kagan, Elliott Abrams, Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, Donald Rumsfeld, and John Bolton. And, rather notably, Francis Fukuyama, Mr. End of History himself, making sure that history stays ended. PNAC had also previously released a statement of principles which described the U.S. as the world's preeminent power and stated that the U.S. must shape a new century favorable to American principles and interests by increasing defense spending and promoting political and economic freedom abroad. This statement was signed by all of the aforementioned neocons, but also figures like Dick Cheney, Scooter Libby, Jeb Bush, and surprise, surprise, Francis Fukuyama again. Which sort of goes to show you that even the foremost proponents of American soft power didn't really believe in it, that there was always a sort of underlying understanding that soft power needs a nudge, that it cannot stand alone. And soft power was failing massively in Iraq, even with all the economic and clandestine hard power pressure. In 2002 then, with Afghanistan having reached a stalemate, the administration of George W. Bush, whose cabinet appointees like Pearl, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, and Cheney, all of whom emerged out of PNAC, made the case that to win the war on terror, a preemptive strike against Iraq was necessary. In January of that year, President Bush called Iraq, as part of his State of the Union address, part of an axis of evil, alongside Iran, which was blindsided by this declaration as an enemy of Iraq. Oh, and there was North Korea as well. Just thrown in there for good measure. What exactly unites the three of these entities into an axis of evil? Well, absolutely nothing, but in the American logic this makes total sense. The evil that unites Iraq, Iran, and North Korea isn't a military alliance or economic support. It's a rejection of the American world order. And to oppose America, to oppose God's chosen country, the exceptional, the city on the hill, is to be evil. And so, by September of 2002, the administration concluded that Iraq was in possession of weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein, as an irrational dictator, could use at any time. Why Iraq was even reconstituting its nuclear program. They may have been just a week away from a nuclear weapon. On February 5, 2003, then, Colin Powell addressed the United Nations Security Council. He presented satellite images and intercepted communications and diagrams of alleged weapons facilities. And on March 20, 2003, the United States launched a surprise military invasion of Iraq without a declaration of war under the codename Operation Iraqi Freedom. supported by a coalition of the willing consisting of 40 other governments. By April of 2003, Baghdad had fallen and Saddam Hussein's government collapsed. Coalition forces poured into the country, scouring it for the hidden weapons of mass destruction, only to find that there weren't any to begin with. No stockpiles of chemical weapons, no active nuclear program, nothing. The United States had torn apart Iraq for nothing, or so it seemed. But remember, the weapons of mass destruction were only the smokescreen. Heck, even the oil prize was only a secondary condition, although I'm sure Dick Cheney was quite happy about it. The primary consideration was the maintenance of American hegemony, of making a point to North Korea and Iran that they could either conform to the American world order or die. That is not soft power in action. The only task that remained was turning Iraq into a proper puppet state, like Iran was under the Shah. The United States just needed to quell the insurgency and assert its hard power dominance. It had always worked before, so why not now? There was no ideological rival, right? So this isn't the same as Vietnam, it should work this time. We just need to find the right puppet leader to replace Saddam Hussein, help prop him up no matter how corrupt he is, as long as he supports our regional interests and resource extraction, and it is all golden, right? Well, here's the problem. Saddam Hussein was our puppet leader. He was our strongman to begin with. During the Iran-Iraq War, we backed Saddam Hussein as a bulwark against regional instability. By our reckoning, he backstabbed us and invaded Kuwait, forcing us to respond to him. No, what the Middle East needed, the argument was not further puppet regimes, but American-style market-driven democracy. Liberal democracy. We could prove Fukuyama right once and for all. It's the end of history. There are no alternatives, and by wiping the slate clean in Iraq, we can build the groundwork for a thriving democracy. In reality, though, what we did was we opened the Iraqi market to looting by foreign interests. In 2003, the American Transitional Government, the Coalition Provisional Authority, or CPA, vested itself with executive, legislative, and judicial authority over the Iraqi government. Its very first act, CPA Order 1, was the de-Baathification of Iraqi society. The former ruling party was to be purged, which removed not only loyalists to Saddam, but almost the entirety of the administrative apparatus that had kept the country functioning. The CPA's second act, CPA Order 2, then formally disbanded the Iraqi army, as well as other public servants including doctors and nurses, which immediately created 500,000 unemployed and largely militarily trained young men. At the same time, the CPA set about dismantling Iraq's centrally planned economy, which prohibited foreign ownership of Iraqi businesses. CPA Order 17 granted all foreign contractors operating in Iraq immunity from the Iraqi legal process, a move taken straight out of the unequal treaty imperialism of the 1800s. CPA Order 49 provided a tax cut for corporations operating in Iraq. You get the picture, right? Iraq was to be pillaged by foreign interests. So the average Iraqi was suffering, their economy was being pillaged, and there was no army to maintain order, no bureaucracy to provide services, and no state to hold the country together. Just this foreign occupying power that had destroyed their homes, killed their loved ones, and invaded their country under false pretenses. From that sorrow, that confusion, that anger, the very same we all felt after 9/11, arose the insurgency. The Americans had ostensibly sought to bring freedom and democracy to Iraq, but now the Iraqi people were rising up to fight for freedom on their own terms. The United States fought against the insurgency with great brutality, and as the war grew desperate, with increasing cruelty as well. Imagery of civilians suffering due to the American occupation started to emerge in foreign media. The horrific acts of torture that were perpetrated by the Army and the CIA in Abu Ghraib prison became known to the public, for example. American hard power was failing, and soft power was failing alongside it. And before long, the war became a quagmire, a black hole into which America dumped men and resources. After 9/11, President Bush's approval rating hit as high as 90%. On May 1st, 2003, Bush stood in front of a banner that read "Mission Accomplished" and declared that major combat operations had ended. His approval rating at that point was around 69%. By 2005, as the situation in Iraq deteriorated into outright civil war, Bush's approval rating dropped to 35%. And by 2008, in the midst of the Great Recession, his approval rating cratered to as low as 25%. The cracks had begun to show in America's hard power dominance, and with it, the soft power veneer cracked too. Sure, Obama came after, and he was charismatic. He promised change, and he received a Nobel Peace Prize for the simple act of not being George Bush. But he was still fundamentally a neoliberal, and his policies were not altogether that different from his neoconservative counterparts.
So tonight, let us ask ourselves, if our children should live to see the next century, if my daughters should be so lucky to live as long as Ann Nixon Cooper, what change will they see? What progress will we have made?
They all still believed in and needed to support American primacy at any cost, and they still utilized American hard power to achieve that primacy. If you don't believe the theory, then argue with this logic: why did Reagan and Obama both go after Gaddafi? Thanks, Killer Mike. At the same time, alternatives were emerging. Competitors were emerging in the marketplace of ideas. Cuba and Iran were proving in different ways that nations could still thrive and even threaten the United States while completely cut off from international markets. The rise of China showed that perhaps other systems could meaningfully compete against neoliberal free market capitalism, maybe even outsmart it. In the present, the United States has declining popularity throughout the world. More and more countries, including our own allies, view the United States as irresponsible, irrational, and unreliable. China's approval rating, in contrast, has only grown. On April 3, 2026, Gallup reported, for example, that China had edged past the United States in global approval ratings. This is what the end of history actually looks like. This is the end of the American empire. But we'll talk more about the present in just a moment. Before we talk about the decline of America in the present, let's talk a little bit about Japan. What you just watched was a video of U.S. military personnel allegedly violating OPSEC during a recent HIMARS strike on Iran to make a cute video with their doll of Shion Yorigami, the, I kid you not, god of poverty in Japanese bullet hell video game franchise Toho. Just casually sending poverty to Iran with the power of God and anime. But I digress. My point is, Japan is the best at soft power. And that's right, I spent like a quarter of a year grinding this video and lectured you for over 2 hours as a retort to YouTube comments. I will never do this again for as long as I live, and if I try to, please stop me. As I've said like 100 times in this video, American soft power is a shadow of American hard power. You see rock music and Western clothes in the free market, but behind it there are military bases, economic coercion, the CIA, and the threat of penalties if one fails to cooperate. The American hard power framework built out of coercive force leaves no choice for most state actors but to accept said framework. But Japan is trying something very different, and we will see if it can succeed on its merits. Japan, you see, is not a hegemonic power. Unlike the United States, Mearsheimer's model of offensive realism gets a little wonky here. Japan is undoubtedly an economically powerful country, but it is not allowed to become a regional hegemon through hard power, nor is it allowed to become an economic hegemon through hard power, as it is militarily and economically constrained by the United States, which imposes restrictions on its sovereignty. And Japan's government is propped up by American intelligence. Consider, for example, that the ruling Liberal Democratic Party of Japan, at its founding, received millions of dollars in funding and support from the CIA, as well as assistive CIA quote-unquote influence in elections thereafter, such as the plan to influence the 1965 Okinawan elections. In just 2025, the declassified Kennedy assassination files revealed that the CIA had a physical office in Tokyo, operating to manipulate Japanese politics. The LDP officially has stated that it wasn't aware of this covert assistance, but behind closed doors, these declassified documents revealed that the foreign minister and LDP president back in 1994 had intimate knowledge of the CIA's presence, as he stated to U.S. Ambassador Mondale the following. And I quote, "The LDP can deal with rumors and even unconfirmed leaks, but official confirmation of CIA activity in Japan would be an entirely different affair, threatening to damage both the conservative political leadership as well as the US-Japan security relationship." Those are his words, not mine. The conservative leadership you placed here and prop up will be damaged, as will the hard power relationship that underlines our obedience. The LDP has a long history of kowtowing to American interests over the interests of its own people. Consider how Japan's economy is at the mercy of American finance. Remember the Plaza Accord, or more recently, the 2025 US-Japan Framework Agreement, in which Japan committed $550 billion in investments and loans into US sectors like energy and semiconductors in exchange for reduced US tariffs. Many of those tariffs were challenged in court and in some cases found to be unlawful, suggesting that Japan may have been pressured into concessions under a framework that was at best dubious and at worst coercive. But while Japanese media has discussed withdrawing those investments made under pressure, no such withdrawal has happened, even as the Trump administration implements new tariffs on Japan, citing the Japanese use of quote-unquote forced labor as its reasoning. There's also, of course, Japan's military development, which is directly stifled by the American-drafted post-war Constitution of Japan. What then can Japan do to project its influence? How can it get around America's de facto hard power embargo? Well, it only has soft power, and Japan has been very purposefully utilizing its cultural and media products to generate goodwill and feelings towards the nation, in ways that are outside of the scope of American control. The LDP, for example, has very specifically singled out anime as a means of aligning audiences with Japanese values, and the government subsidizes, promotes abroad, and proliferates anime for that purpose. Japan relies on its cultural exports. It relies on Cool Japan. It relies on fashion, design, anime, cuisine, video games, tourism, music, TV, and even foreign aid and education programs to project its influence and power throughout the world. Japanese cultural products are beloved the world over. Japanese cuisine is seen as fancier and more highbrow than the cuisine of its neighbors. And we've all seen the meme, right? Thing Japan. If you think of Japan as a beautiful country of anime and takoyaki that can do no wrong, then when the topic of, say, war crimes or xenophobia comes up, you may be more inclined to defend not just Japan, but the talking points of LDP foreign policy. Which is to say that the war crimes are overstated / a hoax, and that xenophobia is different and necessary in Japan to protect its perfect culture. Don't take my word for it. Here's the stated intention, a direct quote as per this 2024 report from the Intellectual Property Strategy Headquarters issued directly from then Prime Minister Kishida's cabinet. And I quote, "Simultaneously, as the international political and economic situation becomes unstable, increasing the number of Japan fans," note the wording here, not anime fans, not manga fans, not J-pop fans, Japan fans. Increasing the number of Japan fans in the world is also important from the perspective of security. In addition to increasing the number of Japan fans around the world, we will work to enhance the brand value of Japan so that the people who make political and economic decisions and have influence in countries and regions around the world will also become Japan fans, making Japan an indispensable presence in the international community. End quote. That is soft power, the ability to get others to do what you want without coercion. But of course, these realities are also not completely detached from hard power. Japan is still a major economy and thus has economic hard power leverage. Japan is aligned with US security architecture, and in the recesses of its policymaking it has military and imperialist ambitions of its own, even if it likes to hide them. But when compared to the United States, the difference is night and day. The US has far more limited soft power than one thinks. One can hardly call America the best at soft power. It's the best at hard power, and that hard power provides an illusion of reality, an illusion that is soaked in blood and death, and a reality that is built on and maintained by violence. Imagine, if you will, that you are a student at a large school, and this school has a bully, one bully, who is way stronger than everyone else. The bully has the largest group of friends, the largest clique, and nobody dares to defy him because if they do, he and his friends will beat them up. If you're a student in this school, what do? Well, if you don't want to get beaten up, you stay out of the bully's way and you try not to get his attention. If you want the perks of being the bully's friend, though, you can do as he says. Maybe you and the bully hang out after school, maybe you help him beat up kids who he considers his enemies, but inside, you know, if you had the chance, you'd escape his orbit and perhaps be a better person. Maybe you can form your own group of friends, but the threat of force keeps you docile and obedient. Let's say, though, one day the bully beats up a kid, but you can tell that the bully seems more tired than usual. The fight took longer than expected, and he has more bruises than you've ever seen on him. The bully in his hubris sees only the mangled body of his victim on the ground, but everyone else notices not the victim's suffering, but the bully's weakness. Slowly but surely, the bully can no longer control the school as easily as he did before. Cracks begin to form. The students at the school stop asking, well, what happens if I defy him? And they start considering instead, well, what happens if everyone else defies him together? In time, the bully begins to notice that his quote-unquote friends are pulling away. He notices that when he bullies kids, they're more willing to fight back instead of pay up. He sees other strong kids banding together to resist him, and he finds that he can no longer push them around. As the fear of the bully slowly subsides, so too does his ability to control the school. And the other students, who remember the bully's cruelty, abandon him the moment he grows too weak to enforce his regime. The fear of the bully is what predicates American soft power, and as we're seeing play out in real time, America is still reaching for the same tools it has used for 2 centuries. The Monroe Doctrine, now called the Donroe Doctrine, dollar diplomacy, sanctions, debt, military force, and stability language for the purposes of extraction. The difference between the past and the present, though, is that the old bargain is breaking down. The fear of being beaten up is fading, and the perks of being the bully's friend are also fading. What incentive, then, is there to side with the bully? For most of the 20th century, American hegemony could present itself as a rising tide. The system was unequal, yes, but its defenders could argue that the inequality was tolerable because everyone was still better off inside the system than outside of it. But what happens when the tide stops rising? What happens when the system offers all of the coercion and none of the bargain, all of the dependency and none of the security, all of the discipline but none of the prosperity? What happens when you omit speak softly and only carry the big stick? What happens when you go all stick and no carrot, all me but no you? This, in essence, is the problem of America First. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of American liberalism and the coercive power it wields. It is believing your own propaganda that the superiority of the American system is what keeps the American world order in place. The American First stance of Donald Trump and his political base on the right, whatever you choose to call it, sees the carrot parts of liberalism as superfluous and even charitable. Why do we have these expensive military bases everywhere? Why do we have these trade deals that allow Mexico or the EU or Canada or China to take advantage of our markets? Why are we giving all of this money to the UN or to humanitarian causes through US aid? Why do we allow others to take advantage of us? Their solution to the weakening influence of the bully is to be an even bigger bully. No more money to the UN or to humanitarian causes through US aid. Why do we allow others to take advantage of us? Their solution to the weakening influence of the bully is to be an even bigger bully. No more perks. If you don't obey us, you get beat up, you get tariffed, you get trade war, you get couped, you get sanctioned, you get your country bombed, quote unquote, back to the Stone Age. What they don't understand is that America First means America alone. And to be fair, the liberal doesn't understand either that NAFTA / the USMCA, the WTO, the IMF, US aid, and the like aren't soft power either. Ask many African nations how they feel about the IMF and the World Bank, for example, or how most Canadians view trade with the United States. At best, they see these things as pragmatic necessities in an American-dominated world. At worst, they consider these things neo-colonial and extractive. Any deal with America is a Faustian bargain. If you deal with the devil, you reap the consequences.
So let's see how you respond. America is backing you with overwhelming strength and devastating force. Now is the time to seize control of your destiny and to unleash the prosperous and glorious future that is close within your reach.
On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a war against the second nation in Bush's axis of evil, targeting the so-called rogue nation of Iran. Why is Iran a rogue nation? Because, according to Vice President J.D. Vance, it doesn't act like a quote-unquote normal country. And if only Iran was willing to act like a normal country, it would be treated by the United States like a normal country. But what is a normal country? Is a normal country a non-theocracy? Well, that can't be it, because Saudi Arabia is a theocracy, and that's one of our allies. No, a normal country is a country that goes along with the rules-based international order. A set of global rules based on economic and political liberalism that benefits primarily the United States. If Joseph Nye's rising tide lifts all boats, we should all be happy. But the tide isn't rising for everyone, and indeed the water has been trickling down more than it's been rising up. And as even that trickle dries up, as liberalism marches headlong into the inevitable techno-feudalism of late-stage capitalism, the cracks in the American international order are growing simply too big to ignore. America no longer has the overwhelming military power necessary to crush any other country on Earth that it once did. It struggled in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is outright failing in Iran. It doesn't have the manufacturing capacity to sustain conflict against even far weaker regional opponents. It cannot protect its own military bases or allies against the weapons of an enemy it has economically sanctioned for decades. It, with the largest and most advanced navy in the world, with its 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and 75 guided missile destroyers, cannot stop a nation whose naval capabilities have been reduced to speedboats and flying lawnmowers from closing a strait of water only 20 to 30 miles wide. America's economic power is waning as well. In the year 2000, the United States was the largest trading partner of virtually every nation on Earth. Take a look at the year 2024 in comparison. China has reached a degree of trade dominance that even the United States at its peak couldn't reach. And with that declining economic power, even the almighty dollar is starting to slip. When Iran charged tolls for transiting the Strait of Hormuz, it did so in Chinese yuan, because with Chinese economic dominance growing, there's almighty dollar is starting to slip. When Iran charged tolls for transiting the Strait of Hormuz, it did so in Chinese yuan, because with Chinese economic dominance growing, there's an economy that exists now outside of the US scope of influence. We've even seen American clandestine power weaken, with botched operations recently in Mexico and Iran. We've been shooting wildly from the hip, oftentimes blind to the intentions of our friends and enemies alike. There's even been a decline in American media control and propaganda. In January of 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the U.S. Information and Educational Exchange Act to develop regulated broadcasting of programs for foreign, but not domestic audiences, produced under the guidance of the State Department, i.e. government propaganda. This act was modernized as part of the 2013 National Defense Authorization Act, which in turn authorized $600 billion for defense, a number which has since ballooned to $900 billion in 2026. And the Trump administration has requested $1.5 trillion for fiscal year 2027. Even with a frankly almost infinite amount of money and permission to directly deploy propaganda weapons against all peoples, both foreign and domestic, the narrative war is failing. Because one cannot just lean on the might of so-called American soft power, the alleged superiority of our system when hard power is failing. Leaders from Canada, the UK, and Europe engage more openly with America's hegemonic rival in China. For example, in January of 2026, Canada signed a reciprocal trade agreement with China, allowing Chinese electric vehicles into Canada in exchange for lowered agricultural tariffs. If the deal goes well, the Chinese may even begin manufacturing electric cars in Canada. Canada gets jobs in manufacturing, and China, well, China gets to sell its cars in North America and potentially even in the United States. We've seen Southeast Asian countries cozying up to China too. In just April of 2026, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar, positioning China as the major power defending stability, trade, and cooperation in the region. Thai Foreign Minister Sihasak Phongketkiao, in the meantime, criticized the United States for offering no help with the Iran war's fallout. Even Vietnam, which has deep historical animosity towards China, is strengthening ties. Vietnamese President To Lam's first overseas trip since his election just a week prior was to China. Lam stated, according to the Associated Press, that, quote, Vietnam would regard developing relations with China as its objective need, strategic choice, and top priority. Global perception is shifting. According to Gallup, China's global approval rating in 2025 edged past the United States by the widest margin in nearly 2 decades. And this discrepancy is only likely to grow. There's a reason why everyone's in a very Chinese time of their life right now, and it has much to do with the rise of China as it does with the fall of America. China is the perfect example of how a communist, centrally controlled economy can grow beyond even the power of the hegemonic US if the US buys into its own soft power rhetoric and propaganda. The theory was this: if we brought China into the World Trade Organization and opened our markets to China and flooded China with Western capital, our wealth flowing into China will cause China to become more like us. This theory was called convergence. Ultimately, though, the very opposite occurred. As American companies entered China and became fabulously wealthy there, they developed incentives to defend their access to Chinese markets, Chinese labor, and Chinese manufacturing. As such, instead of China simply becoming more like America, Western capital became structurally invested in the rise of China, going so far as to lobby for Chinese interests, a theory called reverse convergence. But Chinese soft power is a video for another time. And don't comment something like China isn't communist, Mooney, or the next 3-hour video I said I wouldn't make is going to be targeted at you. The point is, as Mao Zedong once said, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. And sure, offensive realism is just a theory. It is but one model, which is not necessarily universally applicable. But it sure is applicable to the United States. We are making the same mistakes again, predicated on the same poor understanding of history and context. I mean, for goodness sake, with regards to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Donald Trump says Syria will do the job. That's right, Ahmad al-Shara and the HTS, the successor group to Jabhat al-Nusra, the official affiliate in Syria of al-Qaeda, is our secret weapon. And I'm sure our brave Mujahideen fighters will work out for us this time. Robert Kagan, arch-neoconservative and member of PNAC, claims that the end is nigh for Trump in the Iran war. Francis Fukuyama has stated that he was wrong about the end of history and about the China model, which he now claims is potentially superior to that of the United States when we look at material results for the people. And as for Joseph Nye, well, he passed away at the age of 88 back in May of 2025. He never got to see the coup in Venezuela or the war in Iran or whatever war is coming next, be it Cuba or Mexico or Colombia. He got to see his theory of soft power, his perspective of so-called ethical hegemony, fade over his lifetime. But he will be fortunate enough not to experience it die altogether. It is all of us who must live in the shadow of its consequences. And as America's carefully constructed global house of cards collapses, it faces the same conflict that many failing empires in history encountered. It can do things the easy way and adapt to a multipolar world, or it can do things the hard way and attempt to restore its position through force, coercion, and escalation. But history teaches us, unfortunately, that great powers, more often than not, choose the hard way.
There's nothing wrong with criticizing your government when it's doing something foolish. In fact, one could argue that that's the highest form of patriotism, that you're willing to criticize your government, you're willing to subject yourself to being criticized for being anti-American or not a good American. But that's not my idea of what a good American is.
Mooney, I can hear you say, after all of this negative talk about America, you, as an American, must really hate your country. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. I love my country. But loving your country, like loving your child or your sibling or your partner, doesn't mean loving it blindly. When we put anything on a pedestal, when you idealize it, when you idolize it, you detach yourself from reality, and erode both your agency and the agency of what you pedestalize. After all, if one is without flaws, then why change? To love your country means wanting it to become the best version of itself. America isn't holy, it isn't exceptional in some way, but it isn't all bad either. There is a version of America worth loving as well. The America I love is its people. We the people who have always had to drag this country kicking and screaming towards some brighter, less bloody, more cooperative future. We the people who fought and died to end the grotesque practice of slavery. We the people who struggled to gain equal rights for racial, sexual, and gender minorities. We the people who organized in factories, fields, and offices for the dignity and humanity of every worker around the world. This is the America I love. That is the America worth fighting for. That is the America I believe in. And yet as I speak, the other America, the unaccountable America, the exceptional America, the imperial America, the corporate America is starving Cuba and North Korea, enabling genocide in Gaza, and threatening genocide in Iran. There's someone right now at this very moment who is dying of hunger due to our sanctions. There are children out there who are terrified of clear blue skies because of our drone strikes. There is a world held hostage by our greed, our pride, and our hubris. Who could possibly believe in that America? That America is not believed in by choice. It is instead tolerated at gunpoint. But as the fire in the cave sputters out, as the light fades, so too does the shadow. All that remains is a stark realism that is, in every sense of the word, offensive. I've been your host, Mooney. I know there's a lot we didn't get to, but this is a topic with enough nuance for 1,000 videos, and I did my best for you in one. I started working on this video back in November of 2025, and a lot has happened geopolitically since then. I, as a lawyer, usually make content around law and video games, but I do have a background in political science and international relations, so if this kind of content is interesting to you, let me know. Maybe we can do some more of it. Nothing this long, though. In any case, Moon Channel donates 10% of its gross income to Doctors Without Borders. Your patronage here on YouTube, but especially on Patreon, makes that a reality for us. We, together, can make a difference. We must not give into the nihilistic notion that we are powerless. A special thanks then to Larita Shine, Siva Gunner, and Moon Channel's dearly beloved patrons without whom none of this would be possible. And thank you, all of you, for tuning in.
the liberals got the mineral rights. And by mineral rights, I mean everything.
There's a moment I find humanizing of perhaps the most morally reprehensible person in Disco Elysium. It's so caked in real-world history.
Some say love.
I'd like to start this video out with a
My name is Mark Manson. I am the